Okay, so we're back into Descartes now. So we talked about him a little bit in the epistemological aspect of the course, but now we're going to look at it like in the reality course. Like, is he really, are things really out there? And so we're back to reading meditations. Today we're going to do meditation 5, because I already gave you meditation 5 and 6. I probably should have been more specific. Today we'll just talk about 5, and then on Friday we'll talk about 6. But I don't want this all to be disjointed, because that's not how it is in his writing, but we're just looking at it in different aspects of the course, so I hope it doesn't appear that way. So let's not forget, where he came from in all of this. This was a real tumultuous time in society. I mean, he's like the first modern philosopher, because he changed so many things in the way that he looks at reality and looks at the way we know. Up at this time, Aristotelian physics was really the mainstay. You had church authority, people just flat out relying on common sense. We could talk about that a little bit today too. So when he started his methodological doubt, I know somebody asked before, and I think a better way to say it, it wasn't that he's not a lifelong skeptic, but he was a skeptic with a purpose. In other words, he had this doubt, and he wanted to get rid of everything and look for certainty. But once he can start nailing certainty and how he can arrive at certainty, now he thinks he can know things. So that's where it didn't make him a skeptic in the long run. It was just his way to get to certainty in the beginning. Although, to be honest, a lot of people who followed him wound up being skeptics because they saw his project in a little different light. Okay, so he's a rationalist. I mean, we'll see that right off the bat. Let's see. For him, remember, he doubts most of what he can see with his senses. So this is going to be primarily a rationalist point of view. Like, what do I know? What I know has to be on the inside some here, which is where he got to his, cogito ergo sum. He didn't come by that by empirical evidence. He didn't come by that through the senses. He didn't come by that through any say authoritative proofs. He said he arrived at that, and that's the one thing he can know for certain. But now that he's there, he didn't stay a skeptic. At that point now he can move away from that. And we're going to see too that he's like, did anybody see The Matrix? Yeah, okay, so everything's like, almost solipsism, right? Does anybody do the, like you guys have nothing better to do, the word of the day with dictionary.com? Come on, I know there's some nerds here. Today, do you do that? No? Today was solipsism. So did anybody know what solipsism is? It's sort of like the world just exists in your mind. It's kind of like the Matrix, right? It's not Descartes. People might get that impression when you first hear about his thinking, because if he doubts the senses and he thinks, therefore I am, well then is anything real outside? Well, he believes there is. He's not the type that thinks everything is just entirely imagined. But it's interesting. We'll talk about that in a sec. Let's see here. How do I want to do this? Okay. So he's going to look for proofs, but he's going to start by this. So, he looks at a triangle, and this is kind of interesting because triangles have things that are essential to them. In other words, what is essential to a triangle? Like, what does a triangle have to be always?
3 sides.
3 sides. It has other
180 degrees.
Yeah, the interior angles have to equal 180 degrees, right? Yeah, you got it. I mean, it's just like, the 3 sides meet at vertices and such like that. And that's it. That's a triangle. So he's saying that that part of the triangle, those things are necessary for a triangle, he's going to start asking questions like, where did that come from? Like, in other words, those things exist whether or not he's thinking about them, and they exist whether or not he agrees with them. These things are actually what he would call essential. So, in other words, let's go back and just think about Platonic forms. If we were outside of the cave, whatever a perfect triangle would be, that's where it would be, all right? In the heavenly realm, it's the form. So the form is really what he's calling the essence, right? The form is what is its nature, and without that it cannot be. But, this thing always exists in particulars, right? Like, for instance, It may sound odd, but like, oh, if you ever wondered, like, how is it that forms can exist, but they don't exist on their own, but they only exist in particulars? That sounds kind of weird when you state it, but the reality is that you can never think of the perfection of a triangle. Just everybody, if you could just think of a triangle in your mind, you're thinking of something particular. You're thinking of an isosceles, an equilateral, a right, whatever it is. I mean, what exactly would the perfection of a triangle be? We don't know. But we can only ever think things in particulars, right? So even when we start thinking of, like, if I say to you, think of a human person, there's some, form that hits your mind. You're not looking at the universal form of the human person. There's some particular. So even if you, as long as you accept sort of his argument here, we really can't think of these things outside of the form, and the form is the perfection of that. But here's the problem, like, he's always worried about, remember, about being wrong. In other words, he was always worried about he's going to find error from his particular senses and such. But these are extrasensory. These aren't things that are going to be tied in, right? So he starts to say, look, the fact that this thing has three sides, the fact that it has an interior, 180 degrees at the three angle, and all these sides meet at particular vertices. He says, look, those things are immutable. They never change. It doesn't matter if you do think of a particular isosceles or equilateral or right triangle. You still have those same qualities. So they exist way beyond anybody's particular imagining of that. Now, remember, he's after certainty. He kind of likes that. At this point, he's thinking, this works. This is something I could probably really sink my teeth into. Now, remember, this is about reality, what exists outside. So he's starting to think, well, maybe these things can exist outside. I mean, if I started with this doubt and I got down to the basic foundation that Quadrilateral sum, that I think, therefore I am, I now am not going to remain a skeptic, and I'm not going to deny the exterior world, but I'm going to have to start asking questions about, still, how do I know it? And he's coming to the conclusion that he could probably do it this way, because he knows the origin of the nature. He knows that this essence of this triangle, it didn't come, just from his senses. And he doesn't really think it came from the outside. He's thinking, this has to be something that's innate within the human person, right? And that's kind of cool for him. So you see, like, remember, like, Augustine thought that there were innate ideas, but he thought sort of like that God illuminated them in the minds. And there was something, extrasensory that may have stimulated those. And remember, Plato was with the recollection of the souls. So they're kind of sharing this idea of innate ideas, but they're really not the same. I mean, there's differences between them, for sure. And he's thinking, he's always falling into this idea of the certainty of mathematics. So he's thinking, I could really prove the existence of these triangles outside of myself, probably using some mathematical principles and such. So he's starting to get this idea of what is outside of him and how does it exist. Now, if all of this seems like this is just like some old fart that's giving you a lot of information, how is this ever useful? You guys are going to be growing up in the world of artificial intelligence. You know that, right? There have been, what do you think? I'm asking you, what do you think? Do you think computers think like humans? Because we're kind of getting to consciousness here. I mean, we're not stating it outright. We're not going to have an argument over it, per se. But do you think computers, can they think like humans? Maybe in what ways they can, maybe in what ways they can't. This problem of consciousness is not, this is like the silver bullet in all of this. Neuroscientists, they go after it. Philosophers go after it. What do you think?
Wouldn't computers be more fact-based, not emotional-based?
Well, that's true. That's true. And go ahead.
I was going to say, emotions, there's just sympathy. It's just a direct answer.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, do you have your hand up? I'll go ahead.
Humans show irrational thoughts, but computers, I feel robots would only think rational.
Okay. All right. Now, when you're talking about that the computers don't have the emotive stuff, is that good or is it bad? I mean, we want a computer that's a ball baby because somebody bullied it, You're a stupid computer or something. And do we want that?
Yeah, I said not, because that would sort of be biased, because it's showing your opinion.
Okay. And could it do it on its own, or would somebody have to program it to be emotive.
Because like, relating back to this, like computers sort of just like look at what's inside of them, they can't think outside of what's in it.
Pretty good. I mean, we don't have answers for this, right? I mean, all we could do is ask a lot of questions. What can computers do a lot better than humans? I mean, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that computers can do a lot better than humans.
Compute quicker.
Yeah, well, the speed, I mean, yeah, there's no doubt, right? I mean, it could drive through binary numbers like nobody's tomorrow. We're slower with our thinking, there's no doubt of that. How about error? Probably less prone to error, right? I mean, and that's a good thing too.
I was gonna say, but I feel like computers can only think within whatever's already been done, like, as opposed to, like, coming up with new things.
Yeah, so when you hear people talk about computers, they might say, but we're teaching computers to think for themselves, you wonder, like, what does that mean? I mean, you know, and again, this is a very broad field. Maybe they're just saying that we can teach a computer to learn from its mistakes, but you'd have to program it to identify a mistake and then learn from that mistake. I heard today on NPR, I guess, you know, our consumer insatiable appetite for having things tomorrow. So now they're looking about how to have drones delivering, you know, okay, if you want to get your book the same day, maybe a drone can deliver your book. But if a drone delivering blood samples, right? I was listening to one doctor that said, look, by car we had to wait an hour for certain things to get to us. Now we literally wait 10 minutes, and it's only 3 minutes of flight time. So that's 10 minutes from them having the box ready, putting it on the drone, sending the drone off, and the drone delivering, and you know, that's pretty good. But they're a little worried about, there's a lot of things that have to be concerned about here. Not only do drones have to navigate, you know, in between trees and power lines, other drones, but like the guy said, what do I do if this drone delivers a book to my house? So you have this, you know, 2-foot, really cool looking helicopter dropping off this book, and happens to be summer, so kids are off, and they're going to come over and look at it. Does the thing know not to start up and chop somebody's fingers off, you know? I mean, how do you do all of this? And it's almost like the pilotless cars. I mean, you don't want to learn this stuff the hard way. You don't want to say, okay, well, that went through an intersection because both lights happened to be green, and it didn't know that, and it killed 3 people. You know, we don't want to keep thinking, okay, well, we have to fix that. I mean, it's like, and so this puts us in a dilemma. How do you foresee all of these things? You know, you can't, right? I mean, there's too many things that come up. So, you know, this idea of consciousness, it depends on how you define it. And unfortunately, there's probably 100 different definitions for consciousness. So some people will say computers can have consciousness. It probably would not satisfy philosophers' understanding of consciousness. But one of the things, like what we're getting at here is common sense. A computer can't have common sense. In other words, it doesn't know what to do when all things are equal. It can weigh 2 things out. But and I was listening to this one philosopher, now it is an older one, his name is Herbert Dreyfus, and he was talking about, you know, if you a 4-year-old boy, if a 4-year-old boy said, hey, it's his birthday, we're going to bring him a new kite, well, but if he already has one, he's going to bring the kite back. Now, there's a 4-year-old boy could probably figure out, this is the kid's birthday. The kite's the present. Nobody said that, but it seems implicit in the whole thing. And if he has one already, a kite, he's going to bring it back. Does he bring back the first one? Well, no, because usually when you get a gift and it's a duplicate, you bring back the last one you got, not the one you had before. So what he was saying is that, you know, when all things are equal, how do you program a computer to know through all of that? So, you know, in other words, there's a lot that computers can do, and who knows what the future is going to bring, but we're not even close. We don't even really quite understand consciousness. And part of this, you know, Descartes started all of this, like in a lot of thinking, right? Because so we don't really, like, here's one of the dilemmas, is that we don't often know what we mean by being conscious of something. Well, with Descartes, even though he didn't come out and say it, almost meant conscious is something we put things into. It's almost like, you know, my conscious is a box and put these things in here, but other philosophers say, no, we're only ever conscious of something. So it's what that thing is outside and how it stimulates us. Well, we can go back to Descartes, and he's trying to work out at an early part in philosophical history, how do I know for sure of this thing? I mean, I'm a little concerned that, one, I've already figured my senses don't always get it right. You know, like you'll see in the next meditation, hey, you know, I can see buildings from far away and they look rounded off. I get closer and I can see they're very square, you know. And statues that look very small, I get closer to them, they look very large. So I'm a little concerned about all of this. And he's like trying to figure out how exactly do I know all this. So that's kind of what he's working out here. But just keep in mind that his methodological doubt was not like an ongoing skepticism. It was like a one-time deal, right? It's like, I'm going to like just doubt all this crap until I can figure out what I can't doubt. And then once I know what I can't doubt, now I'm going to start using that and going out. So he's starting now to go out in meditations and say, what do I know outside of me? And he's starting with some things that he's already very certain with, mathematics. And he's thinking, you know what? These things are going to exist outside of me, whether I'm thinking about them or not. And they exist because of the characteristics of them, the essential things. And those didn't come from me. I didn't think of those, I didn't imagine those, you know, and my senses didn't tell me about those, so there has to be something innate. But he's still not, what does that mean though? Where did they come from? I mean, it was okay, Plato had an answer, well, they came from, you know, my pre-existence. Augustine says, well, you know, God enlightens you. Well, now he's got to figure out, well, where do these things come from and how do I know them? But anyway, any questions on that?
Wait, how is the recollection different than this though?
Well, the recollection isn't that he didn't like, this came from a rational thought. In other words, like, you know, if somebody says all A is B and all B is C, you know, nobody needs to tell you that all A is C. That just falls from rational thought. Plato would have said that you knew that in your previous existence. And by asking some questions, it was drawn out of you. He's going to say, no, there's no previous existence. This is rational thought that it's, in other words, it has to exist not on its own somewhere, but these things are immutable. They don't change, all right? So it's just a little bit different twist on it, per se. But it's still amazing. Now, sometimes you got to forget that these people are not contemporaries. And it's amazing how far they got with some of their thinking sometimes. You know, especially with Descartes and his mathematics and such. I mean, it's quite a bit what these guys came up with. Okay, so the other thing about this is he's starting to talk about essence and existence. Now, let's talk about essence and accidents. Do we know what accidents are? What are accidents? You're like, you know, Carlos. No? What are accidents? And I'm not talking about mishaps, right? Accidents are those things that are not essential to the essence, okay? So let's do an apple. And I may have done this before, but if I did, forgive me. Sometimes you forget where you said this last. We know an apple by looking at it, all right? It's got a particular shape. The color varies, but we know it's not blue, right? I mean, we know it's going to be green, yellow, something like that, red. We know that it has a stem coming out of it. We know, again, its basic shape. And if we bit into it, we would know that we're not biting into a pear, right? I mean, pears are squishy and stuff. Apples a little more crisp. It also has a different smell. You know, we may not be able to distinguish maybe the citrus smell of that with something else, but we know that it has that particular smell. We also, we could probably even listen to it. Like if we played an audio of somebody biting a fruit, I bet you can get close to saying that sounds like it's an apple, okay? So all those things are part of the accidents. So if we were to put an apple outside on the street, and you know, and I think this is where I think I might have told you before, and I'm sitting on the bench out there, and every time you walk by, I say, hey, you know, Hannah, what is that? Oh, it's an apple. Okay, good. You know, you're doing it from the particular accidents. Well, if somebody squashed it, you might start calling it a squashed apple, but you're just qualifying it. You still know it's an apple. I mean, not, it won't be gross, but if you went down, you could probably still get a whiff of the citrus. At some point, right, between the environment, the sun, and the rain, you're not going to see anything but a spot. There's no accidents there. So whatever the perfection or the form of the apple, it only exists in that particular. That's how, you know, Descartes would say. It doesn't exist somewhere on its own, like Plato. Plato would say that form is outside the cave, and it just simply kind of arrives with each of the particulars. But so the accidents are all those things. Now we have accidents and all, I mean, our hair color, our skin tone, our height, our shape, or you name it. You know, all the things about us, those are accidents. You know, if I were to cut my hair off, if I were to lose an arm in a particular accident, you would still recognize who I am. Even if we were somewhat disfigured, we'd still say like the person is there, right? The essence of the individual. So the nature remains regardless of those particular accidents. So that's the distinction there. Now he's going to start working out though, because he's a little worried about still being fooled, right? He's going to start working out like an ontological argument about God. And he's going to start by saying, well, look, in other words, I can imagine things. In other words, you can imagine things that don't exist. You can, I mean, even if you can't quite put it together, like, could you think of a four-sided triangle? Well, you know, maybe some goofy imagination, or if you like Escher drawings or whatever, where you can't tell if the steps are going up or down, maybe you can create some illusion that can come with that. So he's a little concerned, well, if I can think of things that don't exist in shapes, how about God? I mean, you know, because how does God and his existence come together? Well, he starts to think, well, you know what, I don't think that's a really good comparison. And he says the reason why is because we have to start asking what is the nature of God. Just like we ask what is the nature of the triangle. So if the nature of the triangle are three sides, you know, that form, you know, at vertices 180 degrees interior, you know, those things have to be there. It doesn't matter what the thing looks like. It doesn't matter what we call it. So he says with God, there's this, you know, he'd have to be the absolute perfection of something. And an existence is part of a perfection. I mean, a thing isn't perfect if it doesn't exist. So he starts to say, you know what? That's a requirement in God's nature. So when you hear people say things like, you know, maybe you never did, but over the course of your life you'll hear it somewhere, you know, oh, so you're a Christian, you believe God is omnipotent. Yes, God is powerful. Is God so powerful that he can make a boulder that he can't lift? You know, and then they like start snickering like, explain that. Well, what they've done is they've formed an interior contradiction. You're asking, the nature of an omnipotent God would mean there could be no creation of something that is too heavy to lift. Plus, besides the fact you've made something spiritual physical, that's push that off to the side. So it sounds clever on the surface, but really all you've done is you're denying the nature of something. You're saying, can I say that this thing is that if I say it's not that? That's really what you're saying. Can I say that God is all-powerful if I say he's not all-powerful? It sounds clever, but it no longer becomes that thing because God holds that in nature. The same with the triangle. You can't say, well, I can think of a triangle with four sides. The minute you've done that, it's no longer a triangle, right? So he concludes, I can't do this with God. You know, because if God is the perfect being, whatever that perfect absolute being is, part of that perfection is existence. So I don't have a problem, he says. Now I understand, too, this is him working this out. You may think this isn't exactly a good argument, and other people have criticized his ontological argument. But it's one aspect of it. He's saying, no, I don't really think these things are in the same way. And he even starts talking about, did you get the point on his mountains and valleys? Did anybody pick up on that? Again, it's just clever. It's not like, you know, it's not a slam dunk. And that's what you got to get in your mind. When you read philosophical authors, oftentimes it's almost like when they write, they're thinking out loud. You know, and they're building off of stuff earlier. And if you get to one point and you say it doesn't make any sense, they probably would agree with you. They're probably like, well, just relax, I'm not done. You know, just like we like everything wrapped up in, you know, in a 25-minute sitcom. You know, these guys are like, look, I've been writing this over the last 10, 15 years. I'm figuring it out. Hang in there. You know, we're working on it. But what he says is, you cannot really conceive of a valley without a mountain. Don't they go together? I mean, if you have a mountain, somewhere there's a stinking valley, wherever the bottom of the mountain is, right? But that doesn't prove their existence, does it? Just because you can't conceive of a mountain separate from the valley, or the valley separate from the mountain, that doesn't mean that mountains and valleys exist. He's like, that's okay. He goes, I'm not really trying to prove that. All I'm trying to say is, you can't conceive of one without the other. If you're thinking of a mountain, you got to think of a valley. These two things are inseparable, because it's part of the nature of the thing. So he says, that's what I mean. As long as you're thinking about God in existence, you can't think about perfection without existence. So he says, that's my only point here. If you're thinking that I can separate existence and perfection, just because we can think of geometric forms that may not have that perfection, then they don't, or they do, or they don't exist, or vice versa. I'm saying that's not a good argument to lay it towards God, because if you think of God as perfect, whatever that perfection is, existence has to be part of that. And he says, in the same way that valleys will always have to accompany a mountain, regardless if you think mountains and valleys exist, they always go together. Does that kind of make sense?
Does that have to do with the argument about opposites?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that more, if he would, how he would respond to that with Plato. Maybe it's not exactly, because he's not making the argument that one exists because the other one doesn't, or the other one the opposite. He's making the fact that you can't conceive of these two things together. But that's good that you thought of that.
Is it kind of like Anselm's argument?
Yes. It really
It's
is.
kind of the same thing.
Yeah,
Basically.
it's the same, it's an ontological argument. In other words, do you want to just say something about Anselm's argument, or?
It's just like, if you can imagine something, it's like it exists in the best possible form, then, like something like that, and then he reaches that God exists. I don't remember, like.
Yeah, well, that's okay.
He's saying, so God is great and people can imagine God. If God only lives in people's imagination, then God isn't that powerful. So a powerful God should exist.
Yeah, okay, very good. Yeah, you put those two things together, you got Anselm's argument, right? So, in other words, the idea of perfection and existence, it almost works off this, have to go together, right? Very good. The problem is, and my mind just went blank, the guy with the island, it wasn't Gadamer,
That was a dude that, counter-arguing him.
yeah, he was arguing against him. He said, well, I can think of a perfect island.
Doesn't mean it exists.
Doesn't mean that island exists. So he's kind of got that here, but you notice Descartes not, Descartes did use this as an ontological argument. But he's also trying to make the case that you can't think of these two things separately. I think he's on sound ground there. You can't really think of a mountain without a valley, and you really can't think of perfection without existence. He's probably got something there. I've never been one for proofs of God, right? It just doesn't, it's not my thing. And every so often somebody, you get a couple beers with somebody, they find out you're a philosopher or whatever, and they want to bring this stuff up. And I've always found ways to answer it without sounding snarky, right? So, hey, come on, you're so smart, prove God exists. Well, I just have two questions. What would be your concept of God? And usually that stops it right there, because they don't, what are you talking, because there's how many different conceptions of God. And even if they do come up with something, the next question is, okay, now what would count as proof? And then usually, so at that point, it's like they're buying you a beer at that point, because they realize I just shouldn't have kept my mouth closed. So, but that being said, if somebody were to ask me, like, why would you think, I think there's something to this perfection idea. I don't think it's the kind of proof that we would like. But when we say something's beautiful, she's beautiful, that's beautiful, that was a beautiful play, we're always putting it on a spectrum. You have to. When you say, well, he's a good person, that was a good thing that they did. That was a very good movie that I saw. You're always putting it on a spectrum. Whatever is at that one end of the spectrum would have to be an absolute. Like in philosophy, they don't talk about God per se. They talk about the absolute, whatever that absolute is. Absolute perfection, absolute beauty, absolute goodness, absolute truth. There's something there, right? Now we have to get further to try to say, does that possibly exist? Maybe you have to go back and say, well, if it doesn't exist, what exactly am I comparing something to? Somebody would say, well, I can compare something that doesn't exist. In other words, I can understand how this could be better without actually believing that that thing exists. You can get into some arguments like that, but it's an interesting. That's kind of one of Aquinas' 5 proofs, which don't really prove things, The problem is with things like arguments like that, and the reason why I left it out of this course, because I think it was in the book, isn't it? Proofs of God, I think. The reason why I left it out is because you can only really prove a medieval understanding of a Christian God. The minute that somebody even says, well, I'll prove God exists, it's not smart, Alec, to ask them which God. Because depending on what God, you can't prove 5 gods exist. All you can do is prove there's some God. So really, all you may be able to prove, if you really wanted to, is some absolute perfection. That's about as far as you can get. Which wouldn't make a Christian very happy. Because if they're trying to prove they're God, you're not going to really be able to do it that way, right? So anyway, okay, that was the mountains and the valleys. Let's see. Now, here's the other thing. Let me see. No matter what he does, no matter how he thinks, no matter what he thinks, he's not going to change the essence of a triangle, all right? It's always going to have those qualities of its nature. Because remember, they're immutable. And the origin of that is something innate. It doesn't really come from him. And by the way, God holds everything together in his system, if you haven't already figured that out. So if you take the Christian God out of his system, or some absolute being out of his system, the whole thing collapses. Because he's saying that the only way that I'm not going to be deceived by some malevolent spirit is because God will not allow that. The perfection of all beings will never allow me to be deceived. So that's a weakness in what he says, but which is why he's trying to make some of these arguments, and he's not being dogmatic. You realize he's not quoting scripture up there trying to prove God. He's trying to say that I think is a perfection. Now, we may not be convinced by that, because I do agree that, look, just because something's perfect doesn't mean it exists. But I also don't think that he's totally wrong. There's something to it. It might need to be tweaked in such a lot. But anyway, so you can't distort the nature of the thing. We can mess around with the accidents of something, right? But we can never really distort the nature within it, the form, because that's immutable and it really doesn't come from us. So he's worried about, again, the imaginations, because he can imagine all kinds of things, but he's not quite sure if these things, are these affecting through his senses the way that he's seeing the world in reality. The next thing he starts to talk about is, remember, like, can you have a quadrilateral with 3 angles? Now, again, it might be some, as you're drawing with the steps going up and down, it might be something goofy that you can only draw and you can never construct in reality. But he's saying, no, this isn't something that can exist. I can imagine it. And we'll talk on Friday. He breaks up the differences between, like, imagining something and making judgments and such. But he's trying to get to the bottom of something here. And the reason why God becomes so important in all of this is because he says, even if I can come up with something like this, and it no longer exists, there's no perfection in it, really, he goes, if anything that I am thinking in my rational being is wrong, it's my fault. He goes, I'm not thinking of this right. In other words, he's convinced in reality that there's a truth out there, which is why he can't be labeled ideally as a skeptic, because he honestly believes that there is something out there. He's just curious, how do we get to this thing? And he knows that God has to be part of it. So it's kind of important for his project that he finds some idea of God existing. He's just got to figure it out. But anyway, that's where he gives all the credit, right? So when he says that he's not going to allow this. And why would he allow it? Because a perfect being would not deceive like that. That would be outside of his perfection. But how do we know that God is perfect? Well, then he starts, that's how all his arguments come in. And he says, well, this would be the perfection of all things. But how do we know that he exists? Well, we exist because and he starts his argument. So he works through like 3 or 4 or 5 different ontological arguments, and he's not really trying to say one's better than the other per se, especially in this one. One of the meditation. I think it was meditation 2 or 3 that he talked about the existence of God too. But it's important. So some of the things, like in the back of our mind, to keep track of is, he believes in a reality that's out there. Because we might look at some people who wonder if everything out there is just an illusion. This was interesting. This happened to me, and I can't recall this happen. It doesn't seem like it happened. It was the first time, so it must have happened before, but I have no recollection of it. Did you ever have a dream within a dream? That's weird. I mean, it's weird, like it's freaky weird. I had one of the most realistic dreams the other night. And in my dream, I woke up. And I didn't want to wake up in my dream. And I tried to keep myself asleep. And I was actually talking to my wife about my dream in my dream. And then when I woke up, it literally took me like 5 minutes to sort it all out. It was one of those things where it was like the most real thing in front of me. And I thought to myself, I wonder if you could have isolated my consciousness, you know, if we had some way to do that. Like in that middle part of the dream where I was aware that I was dreaming, but I didn't know I was dreaming. I wonder if I would call that reality. And all these things that, you know, we might laugh at the Matrix and everything else, how it's imposing reality on us, and this is all just some virtual game. Because there are philosophers and even neuroscientists that are trying to get at that today, you know. And there's part of that they understand, like, you know, can we stimulate the brain and cause certain realities? And then that makes us wonder, like, how much, like, people will argue how much free will we have, right? Like, they can go into the brain with certain stimuli, and they can create, you know, certain images with us. Or perhaps they could make us, you know, with a brain injury, we can lose certain aspects of who we are.
Or like the multiverse theory.
Yeah, multiverse. I mean, there are universes outside, which is kind of weird. How can you talk about, once you say there's more than one universe, you no longer have a universe, and isn't multiverses just all within one big universe, that type of
It's
thing?
like all the possibilities of the reality exists in like different dimensions or something like that.
Yeah. You know, who knows, right? So, I mean, you're in philosophy there. I mean, I know that's physics, but these guys are astrophysics. They're in philosophy. You're trying to iron all this out. Did anybody ever see the movie? I know it's a 1970s movie, Animal House. I mean, it's classic. Anybody see it? You did? All right. Well, there's one section in there where, to be honest, they're smoking pot, so they're probably getting their minds expanded a little bit. And the guy's a philosopher, and he's telling his student, and you can see the student's like blown away, and he's like, "You mean that the entire universe can be one cell in a person's thumb?" You know? Well, I mean, I know this whole thing sounds weird, and I'm not trying to, you know, make some exaggerated claim, but we take a lot of things for granted, and I don't take reality for granted. I don't take the fact that this table's here. You know, like I don't know, one friend, they were it was another university. The teacher was an idealist. In other words, he thinks that everything's kind of like part of our imaginations. And he was trying to convince the students, you know, he goes, "I bet you within the course of this 45-minute lecture that I can get you convinced that reality's not here." You know, and I said, "You know, it's amazing. I bet you when the time was up, everybody got up and walked out." I mean, you know, in other words, even when people who try to pretend that the reality's not there, they don't live that way, you know. I mean, they live also. I mean, if you were in high school and somebody was trying to convince you that, you know, you're not really here, when the bell rings, everybody gets up and moves. I mean, well, why was that real all of a sudden? It's funny how we get selective sometimes. But that being said, when I had that dream the other night, I thought, isn't that interesting? You know, so I can see where these guys are coming from. They're not, you know, Descartes wasn't worrying about whether or not the world was real. He was quite certain, well, let me put it this way. He felt that it was real. He just wanted to have a certain way to explain it. And a lot of this hasn't gone away. There's a lot of philosophers and neuroscientists and consciousness that are trying to explain it. Like, how do you explain something's conscious? So this goes back to, you know, artificial intelligence. You know, will the computer know that it's a computer? Will it be self-aware? I mean, that may sound odd, but you guys are going to be dealing with all of this. Who knows? I mean, we're going to get past the point where we just have computers that are being aids to us as human beings and doing the monotonous things that we don't like doing, and they certainly can do things faster, and they certainly can calculate things quicker and more accurate, but will they ever be able to think like a 4-year-old child? And if they can't, then they're not, then we're really just, we have to, either you're going to have to change your idea of what human consciousness is, which means you have a different understanding of the human person, or you have to change your ideas of these computers cannot do what we can do, right? So it's interesting stuff. At least I think so. But what do you think? Anything for the good of the cause? Any questions? All right, folks.